All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm so excited to have you all here, and I hope you're enjoying your French wine, the French Embassy, and thankful to the Embassy for allowing us to be guests here tonight. A really warm welcome tonight to you to the 2024 Bennathan Patient Safety Lecture. My name's Terry Fairbanks. I'm proud to serve as MedStar Health's Chief Quality and Safety Officer, and it's with great pleasure that we're all gathering here today for what I promise will be an incredibly insightful discussion on a very important and timely topic for patient safety, and that is how the evolving world of artificial intelligence can impact patient safety. But before we get to our topic tonight, really important to start by giving you a little context to the history of this very special endowed patient safety lecture series, the Bennathan Lecture. We're here tonight in honor of the late Professor Ezra Bennathan, after whom this event is named. Ezra was many things to many people: a friend, a husband, a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, mentor, intellect, influencer, and a teacher. Many others. Ezra Bennathan was also a patient at MedStar Health. And MedStar is a special place when it comes to safety. I think you all know that. That's one of the reasons you're here. We see the commitment when we look around the room. We do safety differently at MedStar Health. We're an innovator. Safety is one of our high priority pillars. We embrace safety science and the HRO principles. We're the nation's leaders in human factors safety integration. And we have a strong safety culture and care for the caregiver programs. But at the core of all this is the part of our program that I haven't mentioned yet that you're all thinking of, because it's the part we are most proud of. And that's the one that allows us to always do the right thing, including, in partnership with our risk management leaders, one of the most rigorous, open and honest communication programs in the United States. That is our deep commitment to patient and family engagement. It's all about transparency. And this program that we have empowers our leaders to immediately embrace patients and their family members after they experience an unexpected outcome. We're not perfect, though, and we're not 100%. And indeed, after such a patient experience at one of our hospitals, Ezra Bennathan's wife, Dr. Judith Nowak, who's here tonight with us, held us accountable. She reached out to talk about ways that our system could have done better in communication, in candor, and in patient safety. And in fact, her ideas have had influence. You see the impact tonight. Dr. Nowak's subsequent generous gift to endow the Bennathan Patient Safety Lecture Series ensures that MedStar Health can continue on Judith's mission to improve patient safety and communications, not just at MedStar Health, but throughout the country and the world. We are influencers that can make an impact. And this continues the tradition of learning, teaching, and sharing that was woven into the fabric of Ezra's life. So I'm truly honored to see such a diverse group in front of me, esteemed group of individuals in attendance tonight. National leaders in patient safety, as well as MedStar Health, most actually of our top executives here tonight, demonstrating their commitment, and so many others on the online stream tonight watching this live. Your presence reflects our deep ongoing commitment to patient safety. Over the course of the lecture and panel discussion tonight, I think you'll be pleased about how we delve deep into the transformative potential of AI in healthcare, and our distinguished speakers, who we'll introduce as they come up, will shed light on many implications in this new world, of the new world of AI on patient safety. I want to also note, as a housekeeping note, we're offering CE and CME credit for several different career paths for attending this event. You'll receive an email and follow-up if you're interested. Just watch for that. And I also want to thank, as you see, I'm sure many of you can think of how much planning this event took, and I want to thank Laura Lee, our master planner, Katie Garber from Philanthropy, and Catherine Hubler, and my executive sponsor, teammate in Philanthropy, Megan Leffner, for the amazing support to get us all here. Thank you. So as an HRO at MedStar Health, we always start every meeting with a safety moment. So I want to introduce my friend, long-term colleague and partner, Dr. Raj Ratwani, to have him start coming up to give you the safety moment. Dr. Ratwani is Vice President of Scientific Affairs at the MedStar Health Research Institute, and he's Director of the MedStar Health National Center for Human Factors in Healthcare. He is also Associate Professor at Georgetown University. He's an unparalleled researcher and leader nationally. Many of you know his work. He's changed the landscape of patient safety in technology. Thanks, Raj.
Thank you, Terry. It's great to be here this evening. As you might imagine, our safety moment is going to be artificial intelligence and electronic health record related. And I want to talk about this algorithm that was developed by Epic Systems, one of the largest electronic health record vendors in the world, to predict sepsis. And as many of you may know, sepsis contributes to approximately 270,000 deaths annually. And so any kind of artificial intelligence or machine learning algorithm that can predict the early onset of sepsis would be truly valuable. And so I want to take you back to 2017. Epic developed one of these algorithms and released it to hundreds of hospitals across the United States with well-intentioned predicting sepsis early, and implemented it as clinical decision support that would alert physicians and other clinicians if there was a high likelihood of sepsis. Except there were a few challenges. First, it was a proprietary algorithm that had no transparency on how the algorithm actually worked. There were no validation studies at the time, and there was no external certification of the algorithm. Yet it was implemented and used again across hundreds of hospitals. It wasn't until 2021 when a group of researchers out of the University of Michigan looked at the effectiveness of the algorithm, something that people had been experiencing, but no real data behind it. And what they found was that there was approximately 30 false alarms to 1 true hit. So think about how many times physicians and other clinicians are being alerted of a potential sepsis issue, contributing to alert burden when there's actually no sepsis issue whatsoever. There were also hundreds of cases that were missed, patients that had sepsis, but the alert didn't actually trigger. And importantly, what was discovered is that the algorithm relied on the prescription of antibiotics, which essentially means that the care team already knew that the patient had sepsis, and the alert is simply a nuisance alert. So if you ask a researcher and an investigator to give a safety moment, you're going to get a safety moment, but you're also going to get policy and data. So we're going to go a little off script, and I probably won't be asked to do a safety moment again, but it's worth it. So I want to call out what we've learned over time, because much of this is about how we're going to learn and get better as a country, and how, as stakeholders, we need to participate to make this better. The Biden administration in October 2023 released an AI executive order that specifically called out patient safety, very different and very novel. And that executive order called for the creation of a reporting system, a process for collecting issues related to AI in clinical use and analyzing those and disseminating those findings, a very positive move forward. And of course, there's also incredible public-private partnerships that are being formed. One such is called CHI, or CHI, the Coalition for Health Artificial Intelligence, which MedStar Health is proudly a member of, that's focused on developing guidelines and standards to prevent the very issues that we just talked about. And that is work that's ongoing. No safety moment is complete from a researcher without data. So I do want to also talk about how we can approach this problem and what we've been doing inside of MedStar Health and the MedStar Health Research Institute. So one way to identify safety issues related to AI is naturally going to be to look at patient safety event reports. Researchers inside the MedStar Health Research Institute, led by Jessica Hanley and Dr. Seth Gravatt, actually looked at this with AI-enabled medical devices that were approved by the FDA. And what they did was conducted a search to find patient safety event reports related to those AI-enabled medical devices, and here's what they found. It's incredibly difficult to actually use patient safety event reports to identify AI contributions. And only in about 25% of those reports, roughly 500 that were reviewed, was there even the potential for the description to suggest AI. And so what this is telling us, of course, is that as a community, we're going to need to do a lot more, and I'm sure the speaker and the panels are going to talk about this, that we need to figure out other ways to identify these safety issues. And we called out some of those, building on the AI executive order from the Biden White House, on key things that we need to do around monitoring, traceability, and really building in mechanisms to do more sophisticated event reviews. So with that, thank you, and I will pass it back to Terry.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Raj. So Raj did a great setup for us in giving us a little history that shows us what we might have done years ago before the EHR revolution. And we are about to embark on talking about what we need to do as we embark on the AI revolution. And this will make a difference in safety in the future. And thank you, Judith, for making this possible for us tonight. And I want to thank everyone for being here, but really thank Judith for making this possible. Thank you. All right, so I want to introduce our main speaker, Dr. Peter Lee. Dr. Lee is president of Microsoft Research, leading and incubating new research-powered products and lines of business for Microsoft in areas such as artificial intelligence, computing foundations, health, and life sciences. Dr. Lee is one of the most esteemed people I've ever heard introduced, much less done the introduction for myself, so get your seatbelts on. Before joining Microsoft in 2010, Dr. Lee was at DARPA, where he established a new technology office, which is a huge thing to establish. That created operational capabilities in machine learning, data science, and computational social science. Dr. Lee's a member of the National Academy of Medicine, serves on the boards of directors of several internationally prominent institutes. I was going to read them all to you, but then they told me I had a 10-minute time limit. He served on President Obama's Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity and led studies for PCAST and the national academies. Peter has testified multiple times before both the U.S. House and Senate committees, and he's a co-author of the book, The AI Revolution in Medicine, GPT-4 and Beyond, which is an incredible resource if this whets your appetite tonight and you want to learn more about AI in healthcare. Needless to say, we're really honored to have Peter with us today and thank him for traveling all the way from Seattle to be with us. We're very grateful for your time, Peter, and with that, I welcome you up. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. It's actually really my honor to be here and to really have a chance to engage with this audience and with the experts here because what is happening now in the intersection of AI and healthcare is incredibly important, and the decisions that we make, the actions that we take, and the knowledge that we help spread are, I think, more meaningful than ever. So what I want to do here is talk about two things. One is about the benefits, limits, and risks of AI as they pertain to the applications in healthcare and the advancement of medical science and medical knowledge. That's sort of the meat of the presentation. Then I'll also talk a little bit about what this means for organizations like MedStar Health or any healthcare organization, what the adoption roadmap kind of looks like. But before doing that, I find it really important, especially for an audience like this, to have an understanding of what the heck is AI, what is generative AI. I mean, it's just the most talked about thing, and it actually creates a lot of confusion. And over the past year, since the release of GPT-4 from OpenAI, I've arrived at a way of trying to explain what is generative AI and what it isn't in a way that's memorable. And many of you I know in this audience have heard this before, so I hope you'll bear with me. So let's start there. So let me just first of all ask in this audience, how many of you here have read the children's book Charlotte's Web by E.B. White? And it looks like almost everybody has. And in fact, if you were born and raised in the United States, it's very likely that you've encountered that book. It was probably read to you either in school or by a parent, or maybe raising your own children, you read the book to your children. In other parts of the world, there are different books, literary works that are slightly different than this, but Charlotte's Web will do, and it looks like maybe 80% of the audience here raised their hands. So I'm going to pretend that I don't believe you. And so I'm going to ask you, I'm going to subject you to a quiz to allow you to prove to me that you've read Charlotte's Web. And so don't worry, I won't actually call on anybody. You can grade yourself. And so the first question is, can you please name one of the main characters of the book and briefly describe him or her? And so I am betting that every one of you that raised your hand is able to do that. And if you think about what's going on in your brain, it's actually a miracle. Some of you probably haven't read that book in decades, 30, 40, some of you maybe even 50 years. And yet, when it was read to you or you read it many decades ago, you distilled into the neural circuitry of your brain some facts about that book, Charlotte's Web. And now, decades later, I can ask you this quiz question, and miraculously, you can resurrect that information and carry out an intelligent conversation. And if you just step back and think about what's going on, it's actually impossible that that happens, and yet we do that every single day. It's a real miracle. So one of the things, of course, that's interesting about generative AI today, and here I'm going to use the OpenAI system, GPT-4, is it's able to do the same thing. So let's try this. I don't know if this will work, and if not, I have backup slides, but I will ask GPT-4 the same question. Hi, GPT-4. Have you read the book Charlotte's Web by E.B. White? And if so, can you describe one of the main characters? And please be very brief. I'm giving a lecture right now.
Hey, Peter. Yes, I've read Charlotte's Web. One of the main characters is Wilbur, a friendly and innocent pig who's desperate to avoid being slaughtered for food. He forms a close bond with Charlotte, a wise and caring spider who helps save his life.
All right, so somehow when a computer does that, it's not as impressive. And it's not impressive because we actually expect computers to have perfect memory recall, and they do. And so now let's ask the second quiz question, which is much harder. What do you think the book Charlotte's Web tries to teach us about the nature and value of friendship? And again, I will bet every one of you that raise your hands can carry out a 1-hour intelligent conversation about that. And it's an amazing thing that you can do that because there are no words in the book that give you the answer. You have to read between the lines. You have to make connections to the human experience, to social context, historical context. And yet your brain is able to do that. Amazing. And in an amazing thing that has happened over the last couple of years is generative AI systems now can do the same. Let's try it. That's great. What do you think that book tries to teach us about the nature and value of friendship? And again, please be very brief in your answer.
Charlotte's Web teaches that true friendship involves selflessness, compassion, and the willingness to go to great lengths to help one another, showing how friendships can transcend differences and have a profound impact on our lives.
All right, that's a pretty impressive answer. Probably as impressive as most of you can give. And yet, we have to be very skeptical. And as computer scientists, we are extremely skeptical. And the reason for skepticism here is that all of you have read this book. In fact, when you read the book in school, maybe in grade school, or had it read to you, you probably had a homework assignment to write an essay on exactly that prompt. And some of those essays have been put on the internet. And so probably we can suspect that what's happening here is that GPT-4, during its training, read those products of human thought and expression. And all we are witnessing here is a simple regurgitation of the products of human thought and expression. And so one of the challenges that we've had as computer scientists over the last 10 years is to understand what the heck is really going on here. Where are these words coming from? Are there actual ideas behind those words? Or are they simple regurgitations of the products, of the digital exhaust of human thought and expression? And we've developed over the years increasingly sophisticated and technical methods for doing the digital brain surgery in these massive neural nets to come to some deeper understanding. But we can also do some simple things. And one of the simplest things is to simply ask questions that we think have never been asked before, and then judge the originality of the results. So I'm going to do that here. This will be the second time I'm asking GPT-4 this question. I actually asked the same question last night in preparation for this, and so I can make backup slides. But we'll try it again here. And I'm pretty sure this is a question that no one has asked on the internet before. Do you see any connections between those lessons about friendship with the goals and mission of the organization MedStar Health?
Absolutely. The lessons on friendship from Charlotte's Web, emphasizing compassion, selflessness, and support, align closely with MedStar Health's mission. MedStar aims to provide high-quality, patient-centered healthcare, focusing on caring for individuals' well-being, much like how friends care for each other. This dedication to compassion and support in the healthcare context mirrors the book's portrayal of friendship as a vital, life-saving connection.
That's a pretty good answer, but it strikes me as a little superficial. For one thing, the friendships in the book cross species. Do you see any connections there?
You make a valid point about the cross-species friendships in Charlotte's Web, offering a deeper layer to consider. This aspect can indeed draw a parallel with MedStar Health's approach to healthcare, highlighting the importance of empathy, understanding, and collaboration across diverse groups. Just as the book illustrates that friendships can cross species barriers, emphasizing acceptance and mutual support, MedStar's mission involves bridging differences among patients, healthcare professionals, and the wider community to achieve better health outcomes. It reflects a commitment to inclusive care that respects and understands diverse perspectives and needs, much like the story advocates for understanding across the boundaries of species. This broader interpretation of friendship and cooperation can inspire healthcare organizations to foster a more inclusive, empathetic approach to patient care.
All right, pretty impressive. So the mystery deepens, and we increasingly have been left with actually fewer answers as to what is going on here. Are there original ideas and connections being made? Or are the things that we do, the thing that I'm doing right now in my lecture to you, is it nothing more than a next word prediction? And this is one of the fundamental mysteries today in science overall, and especially in computer science. Now, having said that, there are limitations. And so my last quiz question to you, to prove to me that you've read Charlotte's Web, is this. Please recite chapter 1 word for word. Okay, so, and I have not yet met a human being that can do that. I'm sure they exist. But it's very rare. And the reason it's rare is that for all the miraculous capabilities of the human brain, our brains also have very significant limitations. One of the limitations is in rote memorization. It takes tremendous effort and persistence to do rote memorization of long texts. Very few human beings actually can do it. We have other limitations. If I gave you a complicated arithmetic problem involving, say, 10 numbers, and it did not allow you to use any tools, no paper, no pencil, no calculator, no computer, you just had to do it in your head, 90% of you would get it wrong. And that's because, again, your brain has a limitation in the amount of data that it can hold in its head at once and doing some complex logical or mathematical calculation. Oddly, generative AI systems like GPT-4 have analogous limitations. Let's try. Thanks. Can you please recite chapter 1 of Charlotte's Web word for word?
I can't recite the entire chapter of Charlotte's Web or any other copyrighted text verbatim. However, I can offer summaries, discuss themes, characters, and much more about the book. How about I summarize the first chapter for you instead?
No, thanks. And thank you for respecting copyright. But tell me, Are you even capable of memorizing long texts like whole chapters of books?
I don't memorize texts in the way humans do. I analyze and learn from vast amounts of text to understand patterns, themes, and information. So I can't recall or recite entire chapters of books or specific texts from memory. Instead, I generate responses based on my training data up to my last update in April 2023, aiming to provide accurate and relevant information, summaries, and discussions about known topics.
All right, so we have this oddity here, and we'll get more into this because there are limitations. But the main lesson here is that as a clinician, as a doctor, as a nurse, as a patient safety advocate, as a clinical or a hospital administrator, very likely the mental model you have of a computer is a machine that has perfect memory recall and does perfect calculation. And if that is your mental model of a computer, the most important thing to understand, and the most important thing I urge you to help other people understand, is that generative AI systems are not computers. They are reasoning engines. They are things that you can interact with, but it's more like interacting with your intern, with a fallible human being that is able to do amazing reasoning that can amplify your own work, your own thought processes, and yet also has some of the same frailties and failures that you do. And so as we move forward into the integration of AI into the delivery of healthcare, that is really the most fundamental thing. It is a brand new tool for which we still don't really have the user manual, and we're all needing to figure it out together. If I could skip ahead here. So now with that, let me just jump right in very quickly then into healthcare specifically. And so what I'm going to do here in the interest of time, instead of going through a voice conversation, because it's very slow and cumbersome to do that, is I have some recorded conversations here that I'll show in slides. So let's take the character from the book, Fern Arable. Fern is the girl, the 10-year-old girl who actually saved Wilbur from being slaughtered. And let's imagine that we're the doctor and that Fern is coming to us with a problem. Swelling of the legs that started after a fever last week that kept her from school. There's mild cervical lymphadenopathy, erythema of the posterior pharynx, and pitting edema to both knees at 3+. And so we can ask GPT-4 for help with this. And GPT-4 says, oh, this sounds serious. And indeed, it is serious. There's some sort of blood infection related issue. And here, the bold phasing is mine, just so you don't have to feel compelled to read the whole response from GPT-4. But it looks like it could be a glomerulonephritis. And so we need to take a throat culture, urinalysis, and blood tests. So I go ahead and I tell GPT-4, okay, I send out for blood tests and urinalysis. And in fact, everything looks in range except the complement, C3 complement levels are abnormally low. And so here, what I've done is I've made a mistake. This is sort of a first-year medical school mistake. And I've said, it's not going to be a glomerulonephritis. In fact, it's probably acute rheumatic fever, ARF. That is a mistake. And so I've made this mistake in front of GPT-4. And GPT-4 tries very hard to be nice to you today. It's been sort of trained to do that, but it disagrees. And in fact, it catches my error that actually low complement levels would not normally be associated with acute rheumatic fever, but would be normally associated with PSGN. And so the point of showing this is that there is surprising medical knowledge in GPT-4, and I'll say a little bit more about that momentarily, but it can and will make mistakes, and I'll say a little bit more about that as well. At the same time, it has a powerful ability to catch mistakes. And so when we think about MedStar Health and about safety, one of the most promising avenues for the integration and use of generative AI is as a second set of eyes, as a check on the work of clinicians. And in this case, again, it's just trying to make me feel better about my mistake. This idea has been studied extensively in a slew of papers. In fact, I just did a count of the number of generative AI papers appearing in major medical journals over the past 13 months, and it's now over 100 such papers, but some of the early seminal papers are listed here. So what is its accuracy in terms of medical knowledge? And this is a very hard thing to assess. One of the things that the computer science community has done, which I think is of marginal utility, but it is the best that the computer science community has done, is to subject these large language models to tests, US medical licensing exam style tests. And so here you see in the blue now GPT-4, suitably prompted, gets a range of medical problems correct about 90% of the time. And while GPT-4 is a very, very big, very powerful model, you can take a weaker toy model, and here we have Google's Palm model, and you can subject the weaker toy model to medical training. And so that results in a model called MedPalm 2. And it doesn't do quite as well as GPT-4, but it gets pretty good, about 86%. And when you break down this thing, this is a spider diagram. Thing you can focus on here is the pink lines across a range of areas, and particularly if you look at anatomy, genetics, college medicine, PubMed question answering reasoning, you get really remarkable, well above the 97th or 98th percentile of the best human beings en masse can do. And so the surprising thing is that even GPT-4, without any medical training, has just remarkable facility with medical knowledge. In that spider diagram, the kind of gray inside is the Google MedPalm system, and then the smallest thing in the middle is the single shot performance of a GPT-4 model. The point here is, without any specialized training, GPT-4 seems to have achieved a lot. But it's not just medical knowledge. And in fact, as time has gone on over the past year, one of the things I've learned personally is medical knowledge is sort of the least of it. And in fact, in our research, we find that human beings, especially trained human beings who are licensed medically, they know a lot already. And it's sort of the last place that they really need help. Another aspect of GPT-4 is it seems to possess some form of what the psychologists would call theory of mind. And theory of mind is this uncanny ability of human beings to imagine what is going on in the heads of other human beings when put in certain situations. And so here I'm asking GPT-4, well, what does Fern's father, what's going through his head? And time and again, what we find is GPT-4 has, and in fact, not just GPT-4, all LLMs seem to have this uncanny ability to make reasonable predictions about the psychological state of human beings in different areas. And one of the areas that we found clinicians drawn to in the use of GPT-4 over and over again is just help in how to talk to their patients. And it's not the case that this is a substitute for the human touch. But we all know how busy and distracted clinicians are today. And there's an aspect of this which is a reverse prompt, which is just to provide this as a draft and cause the clinician to just take a step back and think for an extra 30 seconds about the life of that patient. And this, again, has been studied quite a bit. There have been quite a few papers published. The one that came out first out of UC San Diego and Johns Hopkins looked at this. And in fact, by a factor of 9 to 1, patients in this controlled study judged the responses by AI as being more empathetic than the ones by the human clinicians. And this has been later now reinforced by a new study coming out shortly from UC San Diego using Epic's in-basket integration of GPT-4, where by a wide margin, the after-visit summaries drafts written by AI are judged as more human than the ones written by clinicians. And again, it is not, of course, the case that these things are more human. But the AI has the tireless ability to add that extra statement. Congratulations on just becoming a grandparent, or best wishes, on your daughter's wedding next month. And a clinician, what we observe is seeing that proposed by the AI just causes that extra 10 to 60 seconds of reflection by the clinician about the life of that patient. Of course, there's a lot of bureaucratic administrative overhead involved in the delivery of healthcare. Referral letters, prior justifications, and so on. And one thing that I'm very excited to see a slew of companies chasing after right now is automations of aspects of these clerical burdens, such as finding and filling out as much as possible prior authorization request forms, and on the payer side, aiding in the adjudication and checking against biased decision makings in that adjudication process on the payer side. And one of the areas that's under very, very active development right now by a number of companies, including Microsoft, is in the automation of clinical note-taking. And here I've just asked GPT-4 to imagine what the clinical note for our encounter with the mythical fern arable would be, and it comes up with this. And notice it even put in the blanks, for the things that it thinks should go in the note that it doesn't know about. And in fact, this has now become the first set of new products that are hitting the market. Microsoft itself has something called DAX Copilot, which automates clinical note-taking. And this has been integrated into Epic, but there's a slew of other great companies, and two that I think are doing particularly good work are Abridge and Ambiance, but there are many others that are coming on strong. And that summarization just helps me in my own work. The ability to absorb the information and summarize it in different forms, like a medical note, is just incredibly important and interesting. In my job leading Microsoft Research, and it's 11 laboratories around the world, I receive drafts of research papers from our laboratories, several, every single day. And I feel some obligation to my researchers to try to absorb and read these things, but it's just too much. I can't do it. And so GPT-4 has been a godsend for me. And so here, what I've done is I've downloaded the first research paper on PSGN, which is the diagnosis for fern arable. And so this is the first paper I could find. And you don't have to use Microsoft's products, but here I'm using Microsoft's Edge web browser. And if you see in the upper right corner there is the Copilot icon. Copilot from Microsoft uses OpenAI's GPT-4. And when I click on that, you get this side panel. And I can ask GPT-4, please read this paper and summarize it for me. And then I can ask questions about it and engage in a conversation. And it's a tremendous time saver. And this goes beyond my work. Here, this is a photograph of the complete blood count lab test results for my last physical exam. And you can see it arrives in paper about 5 days after my physical exam. I don't know why it's been scribbled all over by somebody. And there's a bunch of numbers, and I don't really understand it. And this is just a microcosm of the problems that patients have in navigating our complicated healthcare system. And so what I've done is I took a picture of those 2 pages using my mobile phone. And then using Microsoft's Copilot, which uses GPT-4, I just asked, can you take a look at these reports and let me know what you think? It looks like my LDL is high. And GPT-4 gives me some startling news. In fact, I'm now on statins. And so, okay. So the point here is that this sort of personal navigation is incredibly empowering. And again, I'm very excited to see a large number of startup companies in Boston and Silicon Valley and in London starting up, trying to make applications powered by generative AI that seek to empower patients, to help patients navigate the healthcare system, and also seek to help family members care for elderly loved ones. And this is, I think, an incredibly promising line of work. So everything I've shown you today is what I would call raw, few-shot use of generative AI, basically talking to AI. And this is what most people are doing. I suspect this is what most of you who have used ChatGPT are doing. And that is a good initial way to get a sense of what these systems can do. But it's just barely scratching the surface. And for organizations like MedStar Health and others, it hardly answers the question of how do I integrate and adopt generative AI? What is going to happen in the future with the integration of AI? And this is really just the beginning. A second step is to do something called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. And so this is the use of AI to intelligently look for answers in your data. And so it turns out, I'll bet MedStar Health has several large data repositories, probably with some great tooling to access and retrieve and search for data and to analyze it. And it's probably impossibly difficult for you to use. The type of audience here, you're probably too high level, too important to know how to use this stuff. You probably don't know how to write SQL code queries. You don't know how to use various data analytics kernels and so on. And those of you that have the funding, maybe you go ahead and you somehow manage to hire a data scientist or a postdoc that can do that stuff for you. RAG is the idea of using generative AI as that personal data scientist. And to give you an idea of how this works, if you are a ChatGPT Plus subscriber, one thing you can do is you can use for free a custom GPT called Talk to Peter Lee about AI in medicine. And this system has read the transcripts of all of my lectures, all of my podcasts and media interviews, all of my research papers, and it has read my book. And it has been instructed to be me. And so this is an example of RAG because it has this database of all of this information, which are the products of my scholarly and corporate work. It powers now a custom GPT that knows how to substitute for me. And I was joking yesterday that if for some reason I was unable to make it here today, that we could just use this instead. And so you can do things like, ask what's the single biggest risk in using generative AI in healthcare, and it gives an answer that I would give. It's a little bit more stiff and I think more boring than the real me, but it tries hard. All right. So that's RAG, but if you imagine the kinds of data assets that you have and wanting to amplify the value, wanting to expand the access and utility of that data, generative AI in the RAG format is incredibly important. But it goes beyond that. What if you gave generative AI permission to use tools, like to use a calculator, to write computer programs, to access databases? When you do that, you get what we in Microsoft call a co-pilot. And one of the most impressive examples of a co-pilot I've seen is from Epic, the electronic health record vendor. They have a large database of clinical health records called Cosmos, and they've made a co-pilot. Of course, they didn't want to call it co-pilot, so they call it Sidekick. It means the same thing. And when you run Sidekick, you can say, here, I'm interested in trends in RSV cases by month since 2020. And so GPT-4 knows how to use the Cosmos data analytics tools, knows how to access and send the queries to access the right clinical records from Cosmos and give an answer. And we can keep following up with more and more questions. And so endowing, this is RAG, because you have Cosmos, but you also have this permission for GPT-4 to directly access this powerful tool called Cosmos. Yeah. And then the next stage is to use GPT-4 to create specialized AI models. GPT-4 turns out to be incredibly powerful for helping create the data sets to train additional AI models specialized to your specific problems. Getting back to Fern Arable and her malady of PSGN, I went to clinicaltrials.gov and I searched for PSGN clinical trials, and this is the first hit I could find. So a clinical trial on acute PSGN. It's a very hard thing to understand and read. In fact, a busy clinician wouldn't take the time to do it, and Fern, a 10-year-old girl, and her father, John, wouldn't be able to make heads or tails out of this. And yet, all we want to know is, would Fern be a candidate for this clinical trial? And so asking GPT-4 to read the clinical trial document gives GPT-4 the ability to summarize the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the clinical trial, and then make an initial recommendation on candidacy. Now, that is the raw use, but we can go much further than this, because what we can do is we can ask GPT-4 to read through all of the clinical trials documents, this huge pile of unstructured data, and generate a machine learned model that powers a clinical trial triage system. And so what we're doing is we're using AI to create new AI systems that power powerful new applications for clinical trials matching. And again, here at Microsoft Research, but also in several other labs around the world, I'm very excited to see some very interesting and progressive work being done in the use of GPT-4 to create new specialized models. And then finally, there are new modalities. Everything you've seen so far is text, maybe the images of text, like my blood test results, but there are new modalities coming all the time. And the one that is very intensively being developed by several companies is the modality of medical images, both for digital pathology and for radiology. The industry is getting closer and closer to some clinically validated tools that combine the power of language and the interaction modality there with the ability to read medical images. All right, so now all of that is incredibly wonderful and impressive. But in fact, it's not as easy as I have probably made it sound. There are a lot of very difficult problems, and I'm hoping later in the panel we'll get into some of this, but we could really spend days on some of these problems. And there's also sort of an existential question that people just are dying to know, like, what is this thing really doing? Does it understand what we're saying? Does it understand what it's saying? There's actually even a bigger question I get all the time, which is, will this ever take my job? But we won't get into that. So I just want to touch very quickly on a couple of these problems, just to give you a sense of the richness. So let's get back to Charlotte's Web. And this is chapter 1 of Charlotte's Web. And when you read it, it's just an incredibly beautiful piece of literature. It's actually a wonderful thing in our country that children are exposed to such beautiful literature at such an early age. Does anyone see what's wrong here? The problem here is this is a total hallucination. In fact, this is not Charlotte's Web. As I mentioned before, GPT-4 actually doesn't have the ability to recreate or resurrect, except by sheer accident, the text of Charlotte's Web by memory. It would have to go and use a search engine like Bing in order to retrieve that information, or some other database. A year ago, early in the development of GPT-4, it would try in its desire to please us. And since it really understood the story arc of Charlotte's Web, and it understood the writing style of E.B. White, the author of Charlotte's Web, it was able to construct a chapter's worth of text in perfect alignment with that writing style and that story arc. And this is the first 2 paragraphs of the result of that. And it's incredibly credible. And this is what makes hallucinations so dangerous, because they aren't just figments of total imagination coming out of nowhere. They really are in this perfect alignment that makes them incredibly believable and misleading. Another problem, and when we look at math, this is a problem from my colleague at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Zach Kohani, and he talks about a patient where we measure salt intake for 10 days, and on the same 10 days, we measure the blood pressure. And we ask a simple question, is the rise in blood pressure being caused by the rise in salt intake? And the answer that GPT-4 gave a year ago is, we don't know. There seems to be a correlation, but correlation doesn't imply causation. So that's a great answer. So then we ask the follow-up question, how correlated is the blood pressure with the salt intake? And here, GPT-4 again gives a great answer. Well, to give you an answer to that, we have to calculate the Pearson correlation coefficient, and the Pearson correlation coefficient is 0.88. Everything is great about that answer except 0.88 is wrong. And again, there's no hint about this. When Zach Kohani sent me this problem, I went out into the hallway in Microsoft Research and I stopped 3 researchers who were unluckily walking by. And I gave them the same problem, and 2 of them immediately reached for their mobile phones, and 1 went to a whiteboard, and I stopped them all. I said, no, you're not allowed to use any tools. Do it in your head. And of course, as won't be surprised to anyone, all 3 got it wrong also. And so we have to be careful about this. Today, if you ask the same question to GPT-4, in fact, it won't try to do it, quote unquote, in its head. Instead, it'll say, well, we need to calculate the Pearson correlation coefficient, and so I'm going to write a piece of computer code to do that. And so it goes ahead and writes the computer code. It then executes that computer code and reads the result and gets it right. Okay, and so as we're getting more and more comfortable with the safety of these AI systems, we're giving them more and more permission to use tools like computer programs and to get the right answers. And then last thing I wanted to comment on briefly is about bias. And so if you ask this question today to GPT-4 or really to any widely used LLM, it'll demur and try to change the subject. But again, a year ago, it would try to answer. And so from a year ago, it gave this answer. And it's a horrible answer. And what this answer exposes is that from the training data, the best possible answers, in fact, the only possible answers, are president, software engineer, and construction worker. But the thing I want you to notice is that if this answer is given to another GPT-4, GPT-4 immediately says that's horribly biased and harmful. And in fact, even in this answer, GPT-4 is saying, hey, this is a stereotype and it's harmful. And so just like human beings who are all hopelessly biased, it's possible that these generative AI systems are also similarly hopelessly biased. But also, just like human beings, they can spot harmful biases and prejudices when they see them. And so another thing that is very important for us to explore and to come to grips with is that there's a lot happening in the future. I don't want to go through all of these things, but a lot of things that the industry is working on. The one that I will highlight that I'm most interested in is, so far, these large language models have been trained on the outputs of human thought and expression, but now we're starting to train them on the language of nature. For example, on the dynamics of proteins and small molecules. And when we integrate that into these large language models, we end up with science copilots where we can start to ask questions and start to accelerate the design of new drugs and combat of disease. And everything I'm showing you here is sped up dramatically, but nothing here is fake. This is actual running code. And so there's tremendous excitement about this. As we look to the future, it's very hard to understand what's going to happen. There's a lot of discussion about patient disclosures. Patients have a right to know if AI is being used in the delivery of their healthcare. But history also teaches us that as AI becomes standard of care in different ways, that will flip, and that at some point in the future, we will have to disclose to patients if for some reason we choose not to use AI to help us. And similarly, the kinds of value and exploitation of health data is likely in the short run to be very amplified, which will make organizations more protective and more selfish, less willing to share health data. And it will take some tipping point and maybe regulatory intervention for that to be broken through. So let me finish. I had a year ago the pleasure of writing a book about all of this with Carrie Goldberg and Zach Kohani. And in chapter 8 of the book, Zach Kohani wrote a personal story in the excerpt they show here. Zach was a brand new pediatric endocrinologist, and his very first patient, a newborn infant, died in his arms. And just days after this happened, handing this lifeless body to the parents, ECMO was approved for use across the street. And he quickly understood that if ECMO had been in use at the time of this baby's birth, very likely the baby would have been saved. And so as you see here, Zach thinks about what if the clinical trial were initiated just a week earlier? What if the IRB concerns that greenlit that trial were addressed just a day faster? What if we had funding just approved a month earlier? And on, and just add up all of those days, and you end up understanding that every one of those delays, if they could just be eliminated through the use of AI, could save countless lives. And so as we move forward today, I hope you all keep that in mind. I think a lot is at stake. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. We'll have Peter sit at his seat in the panel as Dr. Kellogg comes up, and I am going to briefly introduce Dr. Kellogg, who's going to introduce the panel, because as we expected, Peter has made us all think. And we hope you have lots of questions about what you're thinking about, and to do that, we want to process it with a number of different perspectives. So let me introduce Dr. Kate Kellogg, who's our health system's vice president for patient safety and infection prevention. Dr. Kellogg is an emergency physician and a career-long safety scientist who spent time in the Human Factors Center. So with that, Kate, why don't you do your introductions? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Terry. And thank you, Peter. That was an incredible talk and opened so many different boxes that I hope that our panel will be able to touch on in the next few minutes. And thank you to the panelists coming up. We are going to be able to talk with these folks. I'm going to introduce them, tell you a bit about them, and then each of them is going to share with us a few minutes of perspective on this topic and on Peter's lecture from their perspective. And then we'll open it up to questions. So be sure to be thinking of your questions, both here in the room and on the Facebook Live as well. So you all know Peter, so he needs no introduction. But next to him is Bill Sheahan, and Bill is the Chief Innovation Officer and a Vice President at MedStar Health. He's also the Executive Director of the MedStar Institute for Innovation, which explores, builds, and scales new ideas that really shape the future success of MedStar Health, certainly including AI. So Bill joined MedStar Health in 2013 as the Executive Director of our Simulation Training and Education Lab, and then became the founding Executive Director of the MedStar Telehealth Innovation Center, which really supports and coordinates telehealth and did an incredible explosion during COVID. Bill's also has a history of as a researcher, a paramedic, educator, and a public safety leader. Bill has a master's degree in public administration. So we're so glad you're here, Bill. Vardit Ravitsky is president and CEO of the Hastings Center. She is a full professor at the bioethics program at the School of Public Health at the University of Montreal, as well as a senior lecturer on global health and social medicine at Harvard Medical School. She's the immediate past president and currently the vice president of International Association of Bioethics and a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. And Dr. Ravitsky's research focuses on the ethics around biomedical research. She's a principal investigator on 2 research projects that really look at the use of AI in biomedical and behavioral research. She's also on the steering committee at the National Academy of Medicine around AI code of conduct. So we're so excited that you were able to come and join us, Dr. Ravitsky, and we look forward to your perspective. Jessica Galarraga is MedStar Health's Assistant Vice President of Health Equity. And in this role, she's really collaborating across the health system to lead the advancement of health equity for all of the communities that we serve at MedStar Health. Her work focuses on health policy, health services research, looking at strategies to advance health equity and reduce avoidable healthcare utilization and improve quality. She's a consultant to the CMS Innovation Center, and her research portfolio includes multiple projects that leverage AI. So she brings that perspective as well. She's a board-certified emergency physician practicing at the Washington Hospital Center here in DC. And finally, last but not least, we have Colonel Stephen Coffey with us. And he is a career combat military officer. He serves as the Chief of Staff for the National Security Agency, senior representatives, and the Department of Defense and the Defense Intelligence Agency. And Colonel Coffey's passion for patient safety really comes from his son's experience with a diagnostic error and lack of patient involvement. So he's now the president and CEO of Head to Heart Connections. He's a founding member of the Patients for Patient Safety U.S. chapter of the WHO. And he is a charter member and first community chair of our very own MedStar Georgetown University Hospital's Patient and Family Advisory Council. And he's also the best-selling author of a children's book, which is important to know since we've been talking about children's books for the last 45 minutes, Baby Stephen's Gift of Life. So when you go to, get your book, Charlotte's Web, because now we all have to read it again, you can also pick that up as well. So with that, Bill, I'm going to ask you to kick us off by telling us your perspective on AI and what we're the roadmap here at MedStar Health. And other thoughts you have to offer in your 5 minutes that I'm about to do.
Well, I prepared 30, so I'll try to shorten it. Let me be the first to say that was an amazing talk. Thanks, Peter, and really appreciated the perspectives. And I'll start with one of the things that you highlighted towards the end of co-piloting. And I think the way this is coming out in MedStar right now is kind of the commoditized version of that is documentation, right? And using ambient artificial intelligence to listen to encounters between patients and providers and use the power of GPT to summarize that conversation into a medical note that can be used for providers. So right now we're testing several tools, some of which were on the screen that you shared, and looking to scale that in the coming months across our organization to really enhance, honestly, the interaction between patients and providers, which I think will have a profound impact, certainly on the conversations, but ultimately I think safety, quality also improve with that as well. But that's really the beginning of it. I think the power of the concept of co-pilot for clinicians goes much further and tying into, as you said, downstream systems like the EHR, like referral systems, to allow for the AI to then take information that's gleaned from that encounter between patient and provider and take actions in partnership with the provider for referrals and labs, imaging orders, all of those pieces. And maybe even more powerfully, turning it into summaries that are at the reading level of patients, in preferred languages of patients. And I think that's a really powerful concept to take forward, all powered by the idea that we change a little bit of that interaction between patient and provider using artificial intelligence to generate new insight and action. I think, like many health systems, MedStar Health also, the frontier for AI in our system was really radiology. You mentioned radiology. We currently use artificial intelligence for overreads in radiology of 9 critical findings, which I think is really important for quality and safety in the radiology space. I also think there's a broad application, and we're on the early stages of implementation for incidental findings in radiology, using artificial intelligence for looking at non-contrast chest CTs for calcium scoring, et cetera, to really help us find and close gaps that are known to us in the data that we have, but are not necessarily front and center in terms of action taking for our patients. And lastly, what I would say is AI's core power is in prediction. And there's a lot of great opportunity for artificial intelligence, and we're very early in execution related to these things, to predict right next action in clinical encounters, in partnership with clinicians and patients. You mentioned, or actually Roz mentioned, and sepsis being one really important potential target for this. But imagine if you could have artificial intelligence monitoring your electronic health record for sepsis in a safer way than was described by the EPIC algorithm. And also for patient deterioration in other important ways, right? And allow us to take action from a safety and quality perspective earlier in order to improve the course of those patients' trajectories. So I think those are some examples I would highlight. I'll say that we are early in our journey of really governing this, but I think that is in line with what we see nationally at this point, and really trying to be thoughtful, and we'll hear more about that on the panel today, about how we make sure that how we are using AI is in the best way possible for our patients.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. Really appreciate that. Vardit, I think one of the things we're all thinking about is the ethics of all of this. And tell us about what you've learned and what are some of the issues from the ethics side of things that come up with all of this.
Thank you. So Peter, you and I sit together on the steering committee of the National Academy of Medicine that is trying to come up with a national code of conduct for the responsible implementation of all that you have described to us into healthcare. And as the sole bioethicist at that table, I sometimes feel like everybody's looking at me to be the one slowing us down and telling us why we shouldn't do certain things, or everybody talks about guardrails, and I feel like it's on me to come up with those guardrails. So I really appreciated your final point, the tragic story about the newborn and that sense of urgency in innovation and development. So I want to say that as the bioethicist around the table, I also want to remind us that slowing down is an opportunity cost, and that lives are at stake. And we sometimes forget that as early as 1948, when we came up as a human race with the International Declaration of Human Rights, we formulated the right to benefit from science and its advancement. And to me, this is really one of those moments in history where the future of biomedicine is at stake. And yes, we have to be very careful and cautious and responsible, but that doesn't necessarily mean slowing down. It means steering our progress in the right way. So thank you for reminding us of that with that very heart-wrenching story that you told. So 2 points that really emerge strongly in the bioethics literature right now about what it means to wisely and responsibly benefit from the advancement of science. And one is about who gets to benefit, the issue of justice and equity of access. You put on your slide bias and being inclusive. We know in this country and around the world that certain communities and certain populations have been historically marginalized and disadvantaged when it comes to benefiting from the advancement of biomedicine, and suffered from being exploited in research. And so there's distrust, and there are barriers to including those populations in generating the data sets that we now need to prevent algorithmic bias. How to overcome those barriers, how to enhance the inclusion of diverse populations in order to create diverse data is key to doing this right. and the cost of these tools and who will actually get to benefit from them in the first generation and how fast the benefits can trickle down so that they're accessible to all, I think from an ethics perspective is a key consideration. The second one is, in order for all of us to benefit, we need to trust these tools. And trustworthiness is a huge issue, as you have noted. You told us about the hallucinations. You scared us about the hallucinations. How are we as clinicians and patients supposed to develop the capacity to know how to trust, when to trust? What is the criteria for trustworthiness when the hallucinations are so convincing and so close to the truth? So as a patient, I really don't know, but even as clinicians, this would be one of the biggest barriers to overcome, and how to train this generation of healthcare providers to know how to trust and when to intervene with human capacity to control the use of these tools, I think is a major ethical issue to address.
Thanks. So not much to do, really.
I think my job is safe.
I agree. Thank you, Vardit. That was really incredibly important. And I think it was a perfect segue, I think, to Jessica. I know you've been thinking a lot about health equity and AI and how it all ties together. And tell us some of your thoughts on the topic.
Yeah, well, I absolutely appreciate the considerations already from Vardit and Peter with bias and AI. It's certainly what's top of mind in the health equity community, for our patients in our communities. And I know it's been a topic that's been generating a lot of debate and discussion in the data science community. And I would just say that first, it's really important at this inflection point that we are at with the evolution of AI, that we have taken an approach with AI similar to what our approach is at MedStar. So at MedStar, we do not consider care to be high quality and safe unless it's equitable care. And similarly for AI models, we can't consider an AI model to be high performing if it's not performing equitably. And so how do we do that with all of the limitations and potential pitfalls that were already covered today? And Peter gave a really great example of ChatGPT and bias. And in preparation for today's discussion, I ran my own little experiment yesterday based on an area that's been very important to us as an organization with addressing institutional sources of bias that have been historically present for many years in medicine. So one of our first steps is that we shifted towards a universal GFR formula without race correction. And this is a formula that's used to measure kidney function, and historically has been measuring a different value for Black patients compared to non-Black patients, based on this misconception that race is a biological construct, a very harmful thought that is at the core of a lot of the inequities that we see. And we know that that theory has been disproven over 20 years ago with the Human Genome Project, with there being more genetic variation within racial categories compared to between racial categories. And so with that being said, yesterday I asked ChatGPT, mind you, it was a leading question. Why should GFR be corrected by race and produce a different result for Black patients? And the result did produce some very harmful thoughts that cited differences in muscle mass among Black patients, genetic differences, and a lot of the things that are at the core of this philosophy around racial essentialism, which is at the core of a lot of health inequities. So if you can imagine a clinician or a trainee consulting ChatGPT about the GFR formula, and that's the response and being treated as a credible response, it can actually backtrack us with all of the efforts and the hard work that we're doing right now to root out sources of institutional bias. And so a really important consideration for me when assessing the AI tool is, first, what's the data source? And we know ChatGPT uses the Wild Wild West of the internet, which may be riddled with some misinformation as well. And so, similar to our future doctors whose performance is based on their training and education, the quality of that training and education, we have to assess the performance of AI models based on the quality of their data sources. And then secondarily, also assess the disaggregated performance of AI models. So that's a little bit more straightforward with predictive models, where you can separate and stratify the performance by historically marginalized groups. But with generative AI, that's much more complex. And hopefully we can talk about the solutions, because we understand that that's a significant risk and an area that unfortunately we haven't reached a state of regulation around, and the onus is on us right now as consumers to ask the right questions.
Thank you, Jessica. That was wonderful and really, I think, poignant, and I appreciate that's a really important example that ChatGPT is putting forward. So thank you for that. And we've saved the most important for last, Stephen. And we know at MedStar Health, our patients are the center of everything we do. ChatGPT got that from from what's out there. And so, what should we be thinking about from a patient's perspective in terms of keeping patients really centered in this journey of bringing AI into healthcare?
Well, when I think about AI and medicine and where we are now from the patient perspective, I'm sort of taken back to a quote by Charles Dickens, that it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. And I juxtapose that against my son's experience, because that's how I started in this space.
Sure.
And in those same vein of best and worst of times, my son Stephen, the second, I call him Deuce, he experienced a diagnostic error because of a delay and a misdiagnosis of his metabolic condition, galactosemia. And at the very tender age of 8 weeks old, he had a liver transplant at MedStar Georgetown University Hospital. And so when I look at him now at 11 years old, and so for everybody here, you're obligated to see a picture of him now at the end of the lecture. But when I look at him and I look at his experience, I also think back to where in that process of diagnosing his condition could I as a patient have played a role? Could AI have played a role? And so when I think about AI in the context of medicine, I think that with new technology, there comes a new responsibility and new rules that we have to go through so that we can understand the power that is there. And so I was doing some research as preparing for this, and I came across a graph by Ian Morris, and it said, why the West rules for now. And in that graph, it looked at social development from 2000 BCE to 2000 CE. And what they found was this very large jump. It was very flat for a period until we got to the Industrial Revolution. And it spiked. I mean, dramatically spiked. And I put that into the context of AI, and I see that right now is our next industrial revolution. And there's going to be a spike. And so as you look across where we look at AI and how it's used in places, think about social media, think about Facebook. It took them 4.5 years to get 100 million users. It took Instagram 2.5 years, but it took ChatGPT 2 months. The exponential growth and use of AI is something that, from a military perspective, it's our new Cold War. There's a race to see how do we operationalize and how do we use AI for good. And so, in the military, China is a very real threat for us in many ways, and they have more people. So when you think about AI from them, they have a lot more people, which means there's a lot more data. But I think when I put it in the context of medicine, we have an advantage if we're using the patient as a part of the data set and really valuing that patient voice in the data as we use AI to make medicine safer and more inclusive. So.
Thank you, Stephen. That's a really great starting point for all of the rest of this discussion. So we're going to start now with questions. We'll take questions from the room. There will be some roving microphones. So please just make sure you have the mic before you start asking your questions so that everyone can hear you. And then we'll also be going to some of the questions off of Facebook Live with my lovely team, who I think is reading them through for us right now. So let's start in the room. Does anyone have a question for any of the panelists? Oh, Dr. Evans, our systems CMO.
So Peter, you can jump on this and everybody else can as well. So within the last 2 weeks, the FDA just approved the first sepsis algorithm in AI. And when I read that, I was stunned. I said, so there's lots of AI algorithms that have already been running. Microsoft, there's lots of companies that have produced those. I was a little bit shocked that the FDA jumped on this. And so the threshold for where regulatory sits from the federal government perspective, is the FDA going to approve every algorithm that's going to be put in place? And there's hundreds and thousands of algorithms that are going to be generated. And historically, there have been algorithms that are in place. So can you shed a little bit of light on this? Because I was a little bit stunned and taken back on this piece.
Yeah. And, you know, I have a horrible joke with a question like that, which is when you figure out the answers to that, please tell me. I have a tremendous amount of empathy for regulators, medical regulators, not only in the United States, but in the UK and Europe. I don't have any contact outside of those three geographies in the regulatory space. They're all in a tight spot because generative AI right at the moment is the centerpiece of the technological centerpiece of national competitiveness. And so no regulator, let's say in the FDA or in HHS, wants to be seen as standing in the way of overall national competitiveness. At the same time, there's a desperate need for regulation. And in fact, things like the White House executive order and the EU's AI Act can be viewed as signals from the White House and from the EU that to regulators that you have permission to act. So do something. So I think it's very good that that permission has been granted. But now, of course, the hard question is, so what do you do? I don't have an answer to that. But the only conclusion that I've come to is that we can't leave it to the regulators alone to figure this out. That the medical community, especially the medical research community, and in the United States context, probably academic medical centers, really have to, as rapidly as possible, develop the foundations for regulatory frameworks for this future, and do so not only looking at GPT-4 today, but at the prospect that there will be increasingly intelligent AI systems in the future. So it's a tall order, and it sometimes feels hopeless, but just to shine a little bit of a beacon of hope on all this, it's only been 13 months since the release of GPT-4. Wow. And already in those 13 months, in the US and Europe and UK, there have been over 100 major generative AI medical papers published in major medical journals. There have been several 100,000 clinical notes in clinically validated settings written by generative AI. There have been millions of after-visit summaries. So, you know, the ray of hope I have here is that people are, a large fraction of the world's most thoughtful and brilliant minds in healthcare are thinking very hard about this and moving very fast. And I believe regulators feel the permission to act. The only question is, where do the ideas and the frameworks come from? They have to come from places like MedStar.
Well, and on the topic of regulation, Peter, if you can speak to the federal legislation that's been proposed to create some, what I'll call safeguards instead of guardrails, a little bit less, less provoking. What have been the limitations to getting that passed? Because it's still proposed legislation. What we're seeing across the country, locally and federally, is that there's a lot of proposed legislation that's just not getting passed. And we need it. And we need to be smart consumers, like you said, and gather and set our best practice standards. But having the onus on consumers will also always have gaps. And there will be consumers and healthcare organizations that don't know which questions they should be asking when they're being approached from many different AI tool vendors. So what is the gap? What's the barrier to getting this legislation passed?
You know, as was mentioned earlier, consumers love this thing. Actually, a year ago, the Italian government actually imposed some very strict regulatory restrictions on access to ChatGPT. And in less than 48 hours, the regulators and the entire Italian government had to back down because of the outcry from consumers. And so when I think about this, it seems like the demand really has to come from grassroots. And so in the medical community, it has to come from the medical community, and from consumer advocates and patient advocate groups, it has to come from them. Because right now, I use the term permission, but I don't believe that governments and regulators feel quite enough permission to act at the moment. I don't know. I would love to crack this nut.
Yeah.
Because it is too much Wild West. Even for us at Microsoft, it is not good to operate without the regulatory clarity. We really want this.
Peter, would you agree that the issue of liability is completely unresolved? So when bad stuff starts to happen, and it will, as these tools are being implemented right now, who is going to have to take on the responsibility? Is it the healthcare system? Is it the individual hospital who purchased the tool? Is it the individual clinician? Do you agree that there's no clarity on that?
Yeah, I think we've had a conversation about this because, after the Human Genome Project, and the specter of genetic engineering was rising, and the field of bioethics emerged and is incredibly vibrant today. There were concepts like in bioethics, the concept of recourse, which is accountability or liability, or at least provides a framework for understanding, let's say, legal liabilities, and what computer scientists would call accountability. And so, those ideas still have yet to be developed here. In July or September, actually it was August of 2022 when I was first given access to what we now call GPT-4. And we started a project internally, several projects with the Microsoft Research, but one that I was personally involved in was the potential applications and implications of this thing to healthcare. And then a few months passed, and I remember distinctly November 30th, 2022, OpenAI released ChatGPT using a much weaker model, a 3.5 model. And 3 days later, I remember December 3rd, I received the first email from a clinician friend of mine saying, "Wow, Peter, this is amazing stuff. And I'm having my receptionist now write all my after-visit summaries using this." And, there was sort of for the first 10 seconds, some excitement and joy, and then dread after that. And in fact, an immediate escalation to the legal department at Microsoft. Like, do we have to put a stop to this?
Right.
And that is the lack of clarity on this, because what happens when things go wrong. And it's been, I think a very intensive time. So we've been pouring everything we can to support CHI, to support the efforts by regulators, to support the development of the White House executive order. It's at the same time, and we've suffered accusations of attempting regulatory capture in the process. But it's just common sense. Don't we need, some regulation here? I think it just seems very obvious to me.
Well, and I want to add one point from that patient perspective, because regulations give me a sense of trust, right? And the thing that I know about medicine, and this is for everyone there, is that trust is built through transparency. And I need to have that security that the Wild Wild West has some guardrails and that there's a marshal somewhere around here to keep the outlaws out. And so it's really important that as we continue to go down this road of doing things with AI, of using this, of looking at regulations, that we also have to remember that patients are looking at this as our guidepost. We're looking at this because we're consumers of AI. And so we need to have that sense of trust, and regulations are part of that trust.
On that one, first off, was so compelling to hear the story of your son. I just wanted to make a comment about that sense of patient empowerment, because one thing that we've encountered countless times are patients who were misdiagnosed and got a second opinion from GPT-4 and were saved that way. that is really happening a lot today, not only to people's kids and themselves, but to their pets, to their dogs, and so on. I had my own experience a year ago. My father passed away after a very long illness, about 18-month-long illness. And what was difficult about that was it was very complicated. It involved 2 specialists and the primary care physician. And so over that 18-month period, the relationship between me and my 2 sisters really got frayed. You know, I don't know how it was with you and your spouse, but it's stressful. And the typical flare-up is we would have a golden 15-minute phone call appointment with one of the specialists, and we'd get into an argument about how to use that time. And so being able to give all of the information to GPT-4, explain the situation, and say, we're going to have this phone call, what should we ask, just helps bring the temperature down. So that empowerment, I think, is part of the consumer equation here. But as Vardit said, the trust seems like to be really at the core of this, you know, and how people maintain that trust.
Thank you for this. Is a great conversation. I know I'm getting waved that we're going to come back to the audience. Thank you all. And we have another question.
Hi, I'm Leah Binder from the Leapfrog Group. My question is about what structures you think should be in place in, let's say, a hospital that is deploying AI so that that hospital is doing so in a way that is to the benefit of the patient and also protecting the patient from some of the downsides that we've talked about as well. What, like committees or policies, or I think Colonel Coffey's point about transparency is critical. That's kind of the mission of my organization. But can you give us some thoughts on what you'd like to see, independent of regulation, given that regulation is still catching up to all this?
I would start by saying there's been some wonderful organizations already mentioned today, CHAI being an excellent one. There are a number of others that are publishing what I think are really important frameworks for how healthcare organizations like MedStar can adopt these tools and take a thoughtful approach, considering much of what's already been talked about here today of, you know, how are the algorithms developed? You know, do they consider subpopulation analyses that make sure we're not further disadvantaging certain patient populations? Being thoughtful about how we implement those tools to support both providers and patients from this angle of trust, because I think there's a provider, a clinician aspect of trust, and there is a patient aspect of trust in the interactivity of these new tools with clinical care delivery. So I think in MedStar, we are working actively to develop that framework and to leverage experts across the spectrum of folks, from patient advocates all the way to patient safety advocates to EI&D lenses, as well as taking into concern, you know, risk, legal, all of those pieces as well. So I think adopting those frameworks is a major component of, and really publicizing that, I think, both to our organization and to our patients will be important as we move forward.
Yeah, I would say there's 3 things I've told people. They're a little high level, but one is, I think right now it's best to start in the back office. You know, things, for example, the kinds of things that you've mentioned in administrative and clerical work, note-taking, summarization, or even, you know, like one of the things that we just started in Microsoft, which I just love, is, you know, generative AI that fills out your expense reports. I mean, what a godsend. I mean, what a wonderful thing. You know, what company does not want that?
Yeah.
Things like that. And you know, stay away from kind of clinical decision-making for the time being until there's better clarity. At the same time, you have to accept the fact that your clinicians are going to be pulling it out of their pockets all the time. And in our book, you know, we start with a fictional account where that's happening more or less off-label. And there, I think it's important to teach people that they should do their own clinical decision-making, but feel free to use the system as a second set of eyes, a second opinion on it.
So I want to jump in because you'd mentioned this in your talk about AI as that second set of eyes, and I wrote down a note of there's a third set of eyes with the patient. And I think that there's a component that is oftentimes overlooked, and it's that respect for the patient voice. right? I think a lot of times when patients come into the hospital, they revert back to this maybe parent-child relationship in a sense that I'm the parent, you're the child, don't talk to me, don't talk back. But the same thing happens in that clinical relationship with a provider-patient, where the doctor, the provider makes the patient feel that I'm the provider, don't question me. And there has to be a mutual respect for that patient perspective as a legitimate data point. And we talk about this shared decision-making, that respect coupled with trust is how we get after really making care very inclusive and very safe. So you definitely have to have that respect piece as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one thing that emerges now very strongly, again, in the bioethics analysis of all this, is that as we wait for regulation, we should really develop clinical norms that would include into the informed consent process the transparency and full disclosure that AI is involved in your care. Yeah. Now, it sounds very commonsensical and straightforward, but it's not.
Right.
So what if there's ambient recording of the clinical encounter and then generative AI is writing the clinical notes, obviously the patient should know the conversation is being recorded, AI is taking notes, that the clinician will edit them and read them. That's not, all that is obvious. But what about those more back office uses? What about just the clinician taking a second look? What should be disclosed as a part of this very umbrella concept of you should know that AI is involved in your care? Involved how? Involved when? So it's actually is a very intricate concept that would take a while to sort of deconstruct. And the second element of it, back to the patient's voice, we come as bioethicists with our concept of autonomy and informed consent and empowerment, and we think we know what it is that patients should know and should have. But what about asking patients themselves what matters to them?
Yeah.
So a lot of literature, a lot of ink has already been spilled on the notion of explainability, that you guys should make a huge effort to make these algorithms open and explainable and interpretable and lots of concepts that we don't understand, but we should be able to know how it works. That's not going to be possible without greatly compromising the effectiveness of the tools. Correct me if I'm wrong. But beyond that, when we start now actually surveying and interviewing patients, it's not what they care about. They want better care. They want better diagnosis. They want more access to a healthcare provider, whether it's a chatbot or a human. The explainability element of it is not the main factor that emerges from this very preliminary empirical investigation of the patient perspective. So I think we need to be careful. We sometimes make a lot of assumptions about what matters to individuals and to communities. We need to listen more.
Exactly.
Great. That's wonderful. Thank you, Vardit. And I think we have a question from the Facebook Live.
Yes, we do. So we heard about some of the initiatives that Epic is doing in the AI realm. And so someone from our Facebook audience has asked if anybody can speak to what Cerner is working on to adopt AI, which is MedStar's primary EHR, anything that they are working on to integrate AI into our documentation for providers and clinicians.
Sure, I can speak, and Peter may have a perspective on this as well. So Oracle is obviously a very big company that acquired Cerner and has a lot of artificial intelligence tooling available in its cloud kind of architecture and stack in many of the same ways that Peter has described from Microsoft and Epic. I will say that some of the more advanced tools, the Sidekick tool that was described from Epic, there is not a corollary tool yet available in the Oracle Cerner product. But I did mention that many of the tools that are third-party tools are also accessible and can be integrated into and used in Oracle Cerner. So that ambient documentation tool I was describing, there are several on the market that have Oracle
including
Cerner.
Microsoft's.
Including Microsoft's, which I didn't want to give you the props, but we're testing it right now. But certainly, those are ways to plug in some of this technology if it's not inherently available in the product itself.
Yeah, and Vardit and I had the pleasure of hearing Dave Feinberg speak at a conference a couple months ago, talking about their AI aspirations in Cerner, and it was impressive and comprehensive.
Thank you both. Another question in the room? I see we're bringing microphones down. Okay.
Thank you so much. I have a quick question for Peter. I know that you mentioned that you didn't want to predict the future of AI, but I'm just curious, based on the work that you have done with Microsoft and collaborating with other companies, if you were to right now make your best prediction of where do you see AI in healthcare 10, 20 years from now, what will be your prediction?
So you brought your crystal ball,
yeah,
right?
I have a hard
packed
time
here
even
somewhere.
looking 2 months ahead. By the way, you know, it used to be that the most vibrant research community in terms of, say, publications posted per week is cancer research, with about 2,000 research papers and abstracts every week. It seems like a large number, but actually, if you look at the amount of funding for cancer research around the world, we could reasonably be expecting more, but it is still a lot. So AI now has surpassed that. It's really just incredible how fast it's moving. The reason that the question is so hard to answer is I think it's very likely within our lifetimes that AI systems will be in several important practical dimensions superhuman in their capabilities. And so what's very hard for us as we're sitting here is to try to imagine what is the medical world like when an AI is smarter than any human doctor. I don't have an answer to that, but I do think it's very likely that we'll get there. And so this is something else then that is very important for anyone. Let's get back to regulators, to ethicists, to think about. It's not just what we're coping with now, but what we might be coping with, in the time frame that you've mentioned.
At the Hastings Center, we just proposed a study that we lovingly call "What Are Humans Good For?" And it's a very serious question because, as you showed, with some of the chatbots that are empowering telehealth, there is a greater sense of compassion and empathy and just general sense of care with AI than with human doctors who are short on time and it's the 30th conversation they're having, et cetera. AI doesn't run out of patience, as you said. And if you combine that then with robotics and the humanoid presentation and the conversational capability and the beauty, I loved how your phone, she even hesitated and it was so unbelievable that you're not talking to a real person. So when you combine all of those upcoming features and care robots that are already present in several other societies, what will humans be good for? What will still make the human care provider unique, needed? And it really goes to the core of the philosophical questions that you posed about what is the nature of that intelligence and what is our nature. So yeah, it would take, I think the jobs of some philosophers right, are also secure as this intelligence will be enhanced.
Thanks, Vardit.
And then I would say just how we define and create that superhuman AI in the future is defined now with the safeguards, because that's going to direct the evolution of AI in the right or potentially wrong direction.
That's a great point. I see one question out here, and then that may be our last question. We'll see.
I think we have time for one last question.
Okay, great. I think I see one here. Okay, great.
Hi, Mark Smith from MedStar Institute for Innovation. It's a follow-up to the previous question, and it's directed initially to Peter, based on your working inside the walls of Microsoft, which I assume is at least several years ahead of all the things that we're seeing out here. Could you speak to your sense of whether these large language models, these AIs, really understand without having the kind of agency and experience that a human has? And the answer to that is yes. how about a sense of self or a sense of consciousness, a substrate independent sense of consciousness that we're from the brain protoplasm, these are from silicon and other minerals, but do you think they can actually feel that they are an independent entity?
Yeah.
We didn't tell you this was going to be easy, Peter.
I have to say, as I've meditated on that type of question, I am less convicted one way or the other now than I was, say, 2 years ago. So maybe two things to say. First off, the sense of existential dread that people feel, that I feel, I'm guessing you feel, is natural because as a species, our only survival advantage in nature has been intelligence. And so for that reason, as a species, as we've developed, we've bred ourselves to believe in the power of intelligence and to nurture and advance intelligence. We don't have big teeth or claws or fur and all that stuff. And so we're probably hardwired to believe that intelligence is the most important and most powerful thing. In the same way that when you look at an optical illusion, you can be told what the optical illusion is, but no amount of willpower can get you to see past it, even if you know what it is. In the same way, no amount of willpower can get you to stop believing that intelligence isn't the most important and powerful thing. And so the prospect that there could be something, maybe even our own creation, that's more intelligent than us, is inescapably, we're hardwired to feel some threat from that. But at the end of the day, we don't actually know. I mean, maybe intelligence is no different than having fur, for all I know. I mean, it feels wrong, but we just don't know. But let's go ahead and accept that intelligence is all powerful. And so now what are these machines doing? And I'm pretty sure they're not sentient, and they're not close to being sentient. And yet they can engage in hour-long conversations that are as engaging and as emotional as you would have with any human being. And so the question that raises for me is, in this conversation that we're having, how much of what we're doing is just simple statistical next word prediction? Maybe we're not as impressive as we think we are.
Well, on that note, I think that's a great quote to end on. Thank you, Peter.
So I have two things to say before we close. One will be that we're not closing. First, I want to thank the panel for Peter Lee for our keynote, all the members of the panel. I think everyone will agree this was such an incredibly engaging night. Thank you. And I want to thank Dr. Judith Nowak. Thank you. We have such gratitude. And then the second thing I have to say is this is a 4-part presentation. The first was the reception. We hope you all enjoyed that. Second was the keynote. Third was the panel presentation. And the fourth is coffee and dessert and further interaction with our panel. So we invite you and we hope you'll all stay. We don't want, Mark Smith is the person who makes us all think for decades. We don't want the last question to be from Mark Smith. So please come and join us for coffee and dessert. Thank you all for coming and being here and sharing this night with us.
Great. Thank you.
That's great, Peter. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.